My goal is to be able to give back to my parents for their generosity. My early thoughts were influenced by my parents' love and hard work, which is why I started thinking this way. They worked hard to support my future and found the money for my schooling despite their lack of income. I responded by doing everything I could, and after high school I set my sights on a private university. However, there were budgetary limitations. To help me, though, my parents looked into school loans and scholarships. I concentrated on my studies in the hopes of receiving a merit-based scholarship. As a scholarship student in university, I was able to lessen the financial strain on my family. My parents did, however, contribute to some of the expenses for food, rent, and supplies. I continued to maintain my grades until I graduated from college by juggling my academics with part-time work. I thought I was finally beginning to pay my parents back for their hard work when I was offered a position at a prestigious international corporation. My new existence was motivated by my desire to support my parents through my own efforts. However, I worked for a very competitive international corporation, and I was under constant pressure to produce. I made a lot of blunders in my first year and received a lot of reprimands from my manager. I persisted in working hard in spite of this, motivated by the need to provide for my family. I earned my seniors' and superiors' trust as I adapted to the work and discovered effective approaches to deliver outcomes. After 5 years with the organization, I was given additional responsibilities and elevated to team leader. I had chances for promotions and pay increases as a result of my efforts, and I routinely received great ratings on performance reviews. After 10 years of careful saving, I was eventually able to accumulate a sizable financial cushion. During my 10th year, I had an intense urge to express my appreciation to my parents in a material way. My savings had nearly reached the desired amount by then, and my income had leveled off. I was thinking of a scheme to give my folks a new home as a present. Their old single-family home, where they had lived for a long time, was falling apart all around. I wanted to give them a decent living space and release them from that everyday existence. I was worried that our parents had been having problems with my younger sister. Being the second daughter, she had been pampered from an early age and had become dependent on our parents as an adult. I wanted to give back to my parents in some way, even if they also chose not to take her away from them by force. I so began my quest for the ideal home. I mostly searched for properties in the neighborhood where my parents had lived for a long time, choosing several that were near hospitals, easy to get to public transportation, and had convenient shopping. I went to real estate offices on the weekends, went to model rooms and viewing several times, and tried to find a house that would, as much as possible, satisfy my parents' preferences. I looked at a number of properties before deciding on the perfect one, and I quickly moved forward with the purchase. The house included a large living room and a kitchen with the newest appliances, and it was south-facing with plenty of sunlight. Additionally, my mother and father had separate areas on the second level thanks to the layout, which could be adjusted for future caring needs. It gave me great confidence that I could give my parents a safe and convenient living space. To be honest, it cost a lot more than I had anticipated to outfit it with all these amenities. After making the down payment, I experienced a brief sense of relief, but the knowledge that I would eventually have to make monthly mortgage payments weighed heavily on my life. Nevertheless, I had no regrets despite this fact. Instead, I was more satisfied that I had managed to get to the point where my carefully thought out and gradually accumulated efforts were at last recognized. At first, my parents were shocked and incredulous when I told them about the new house purchase. I can still recall my father's unmistakable smile as he said, "Are you really sure?" over and over. I never thought I could live in such a splendid house. My mother remarked emotionally as she again looked at the pictures of the house, and she only whispered, "Thank you." The greatest reward for me was witnessing my parents' genuine happiness, which confirmed to me once more that this decision was the right one. Realizing that my efforts had at last reached them in a tangible form warmed my heart. Their new life began, and the move preparations went without a hitch. I was always pleased to see my parents sitting in the living room of the new home, looking content and at ease. This prompted me to approach my own life with even more positivity. However, the beginning of this hopeful new life gradually came with a sense of discomfort. Initially, I watched my parents live in the new house while steadily continuing to make mortgage repayments. The monthly payments were by no means small, but I encouraged myself by thinking, this is my way of giving back to them. However, the opportunities to be thanked for my efforts gradually decreased, and it began to feel like an expected duty. As my job became busier, the time I could see my parents decreased. Eventually, I heard that my sister was frequently visiting my parents' house. Curious, I called her. Have you been going to Mom and Dad's house every day recently? What about your apartment? I asked. Then, unexpectedly, she replied, I've moved out of the apartment. I've decided to live with them from now on. What? Why so suddenly? Well, there were various things. Anyway, that's the situation, she said lightly, and I was momentarily at a loss for words. The fact that my sister was also living in the house I had bought for my parents somehow felt off, and a small unease grew within me. After all, I wondered how much she really understood the responsibility I had carried, the inner conflicts that came with it, and the decision I had made solely for our parents' sake. Moreover, the fact that my parents had not informed me in advance about my sister moving into the house also felt unsettling. Even a single word of consultation might have made me feel differently. I rolled over in my head. In that moment, I felt as if my existence was reduced to merely providing money, weighing heavily on my heart. Since my sister started living with my parents, an unsettling restlessness continued in my heart. This was especially true every time my parents told me how naturally my sister had adapted to living in the new house, as if she had always lived there. Hearing that, a small discomfort slowly spread in the depths of my heart. It was hard to describe this feeling as either jealousy or anger. It was slightly different from either emotion, a complex sentiment that couldn't be easily put into words. Feeling unable to sort out my feelings, I decided to visit my parents' house the next weekend. Once there, I saw my sister relaxing and watching TV in the living room. I sat down beside her. Then, seizing the moment, I decided to voice the question that had been lingering in my mind. Hey, why did you move out of your apartment? Did Mom and Dad say something to you? My sister answered nonchalantly with a slight smile. Because I was having a tough time with money. Mom and Dad said I could live here, and I thought you would naturally agree. At that moment, the small discomfort in my chest swelled suddenly and pressed down heavily. It seemed that I had been completely left out of this discussion between my parents and my sister. Her words intensified the discomfort inside me. When I bought this house, it involved considerable effort and sacrifice. I could finally acquire the house after long hours of overtime and working on holidays. Yet within the family it seemed natural for my sister to live here, a notion I simply could not accept. Why allow my sister to live here without considering me the investor? It's not that my sister was at fault. She was merely following our parents' words. But to me, this house wasn't just a building. It was the embodiment of my efforts. And a symbol of my pride. That's why I felt resistance to sharing it easily, even with my sister. Therefore, I decided to ask my parents as well. Mom, I heard Nicole is living here now, but why didn't you tell me anything? When I asked, my mother began to speak with an awkward expression. Because you seemed busy. I thought I shouldn't trouble you with it. These words left me feeling helpless. Busy as I was, I regretted not being involved in this important decision. I also talked to my father. It's natural to help each other because we're family, he said clearly. I felt frustrated that I couldn't argue with that. Indeed, maybe it's because we're family that we should support each other. However, it felt like my burdens and feelings as the one supporting them were being overlooked, leaving me dissatisfied. Weeks after my sister and parents started living together, I noticed a gradual change in the atmosphere at home. Despite being home often, my sister did not help with household chores and was mostly uninvolved. She seemed to be relaxing in her room most of the time and contributed nothing to the household expenses, despite having a job. This situation continued, and I couldn't help feeling discontent. The unease inside me only grew. It seemed an uncomfortable feeling had taken root within me. One day, compounded by stress at work, I finally expressed my feelings to my sister honestly. "Have you ever considered how hard I worked to buy that house? I'm still paying the mortgage, yet you contribute nothing to the living expenses and don't even seem to be looking for a new apartment. It feels like my efforts are being ignored, and honestly, it's tough." My sister looked surprised, and after a moment of silence, she spoke in a small voice. "I didn't know you felt that way, but buying the house was your decision, and it's hard for everyone. I was just overwhelmed with my own issues." Hearing this, I realized why I had exploded with emotion. I wanted my sister to understand the thoughts and efforts I had put into that house and to acknowledge them. Through this incident with my sister and parents, I deeply felt the importance of boundaries in family relationships. Just because we are family, we should not take sharing everything for granted, but build our relationship while respecting each other's efforts and feelings. I don't know how my relationship with my sister will change in the future. However, by gradually expressing the frustrations I had been holding inside, I might be able to rebuild my relationship with her. That day marked a turning point in my life. My parents hosted a housewarming party. The fact that I was not invited was just the beginning. Had it not been for that event, I might not have experienced such deep pain and loneliness. But reality was harsh and merciless. About a month ago, I had heard from my parents that they were planning a housewarming party. At that time, I felt nothing. "The house is new, so let's celebrate grandly," they said, and I naturally agreed. I planned to adjust my schedule to attend. However, days passed, and I received no information about when it would be held. Having expected to be invited, I started to feel uneasy. About 2 weeks ago, during a long overdue visit home, I noticed something different. My parents, who used to laugh and chat often, now seemed a bit cold. My sister's gaze was sharp. Even though I felt this discomfort, I thought it might just be my imagination. However, the lack of communication confirmed my suspicions, and I decided to take action. One afternoon, I hesitated but ultimately decided to go to my parents' house. I didn't call or message them in advance. When I rang the doorbell and entered the house unannounced, I found it bustling. My parents and sister were busy preparing decorations and arranging catering. I approached my sister, who was nearby. "What are you doing?" "What does it look like?" "We're preparing for the housewarming party. The guests will arrive soon," she replied. I was stunned and managed to say, "I didn't get any notification." She responded coldly, "We didn't send one. Do we need to invite you? Your role is over." I was speechless at her ruthlessness. A chilling sensation enveloped my heart. Instinctively, I asked, "What?" But my sister's eyes were looking somewhere far away. My parents were looking in my direction. Both spoke to me with indifferent expressions, without lifting their faces. "We've raised you and paid your university tuition. This is the least you can do," they said. Those words spread an indescribable chill through my heart. It was as if they were saying I was no longer needed. Then my sister coldly declared, "Your role is finished. Get out of the house." Her words echoed in my ears and pierced my heart. The cold expression on my sister's face and her words seemed meaningless. Or was it just me who felt that way? My parents, too, were there, laughing and saying nothing. I couldn't suppress the rising anger and sadness inside me. The frustration of having spent 10 years working hard and making sacrifices for my family, only to be treated as if it were all meaningless, was indescribable. However, I did not show my feelings outwardly. At that moment, a decision formed in my heart. I had come this far without letting my family know that I was the owner of the house, but there was no reason to remain silent any longer. Right then, I took out the deed to the house and presented it in front of them. I am the owner of this house, and I have no intention of changing that. I've been paying all the mortgage for this house. You've been living here because I allowed it, I declared firmly. The faces of my parents and sister contorted. My sister tried to argue, but I cut her off. If you intend to kick me out, it's simple. You are the ones who will leave this house. They looked at me incredulously, but I continued without flinching, expressing my determination. If you want to continue living here, you should have at least shown some gratitude. But that chance is gone. I will no longer be your sacrifice. Afterward, I formally notified them through a lawyer that they had to vacate the house and gave them a grace period to leave. Naturally, my parents and sister begged, yelled, and threw various emotions at me, but I did not change my mind. I reminded myself that this was a necessary step for me to move forward in life. Eventually, they had no choice but to leave the house. After they were evicted, my sister went around to our relatives' houses, spewing complaints and insults about me. She suddenly kicked us out of the house, she repeatedly claimed, portraying themselves as unfairly treated. However, our relatives gradually began to realize the truth, the fact that my sister had moved out of her apartment without planning ahead, and that the entire family had taken it for granted to rely on me came to light. Additionally, it became known that I had taken on a decade's worth of effort and a substantial mortgage to buy the house and support the family's lifestyle. The inconsistency between my sister's claims and my actions led the relatives to eventually distrust her story. Some even reached out to me to hear my side of the situation. I explained the circumstances of the house purchase and the attitudes of my parents and sister calmly and without emotion. As a result, the relatives agreed with my stance and were critical of my parents and sister for depending on me excessively and lacking gratitude. My sister's actions resulted in the family becoming isolated. A consequence of these facts becoming known to others was that, as I severed ties with my family, they became isolated from our relatives as well. Following this, my parents and sister found themselves in severe financial difficulty. At first, my mother struggled with managing living expenses and sought help from relatives. However, the response they received was cold, and they were mostly alienated due to their selfish actions. Both my sister and father also received little support from our relatives. My mother repeatedly apologized to me in tears, but I did not respond. Since that day, I have blocked all contact with my parents and sister. The bond that once existed in our family, known for its mutual support among relatives, completely collapsed as a mere result of ruthless actions. Nevertheless, I did not step back but moved steadily forward to the next step. After stopping the mortgage payments, I immediately contacted professionals and started the process of selling the house. After ensuring there were no legal issues, I assessed the condition and value of the house and prepared it for the market. This decision marks a new beginning for me. I reaffirmed to myself repeatedly I could not reclaim the past. However, I understood that I needed to take action for my current self in order to envision a future. The event that would change my life by 180 degrees began with a piece of news I stumbled upon one day. It was a report that the real estate market was unexpectedly booming, and the land value in the area where I had bought my house was rising sharply. When I heard this information, it felt as if a current had run through my mind. Until then, I had never deeply considered the value of the house I owned. It was something I had purchased merely to provide a comfortable living space for my family. When I received the appraisal results a few days later, I was astounded. About 10% more than the purchase price might be obtained if the house is sold. Furthermore, given the strong demand for homes in the neighborhood, the selling price can rise even more under certain circumstances. This information gave me hope that the challenging times I had been through were coming to an end. I made the decision to sell without hesitation, and I started the arrangements right away. My hands worked swiftly through the many duties that needed to be completed, including gathering paperwork, checking the house, and negotiating with real estate agents. After several weeks, the day came to finalize the house's sale. I took the papers in my hand and slipped out of the house by myself that morning. I sensed that I was not the same person I once was as I looked into my family's eyes. I must have seemed like a cold-hearted person to them, but they were unable to comprehend how much their behavior had hurt me. I had made a clear commitment to act mercilessly, to break with the past, and to go forward into a new future. The outcome exceeded expectations, as the house's ultimate selling price was almost 15% greater than the original acquisition price. I first achieved financial freedom by paying off the long-standing mortgage in full with that money. My sister and parents were still having trouble finding a new home, according to family members I spoke with in the interim. It was hard for them to find a good place to live without a lot of money. Family members and neighbors started disparaging my mother, saying things like wasting her daughter's efforts and losing an important house for their own selfish desires. She no longer had the tranquil days she had before, and these judgments turned into a terrible social strain that tore at her heart like nothing she had ever known. Even though my sister was somewhat aware that her careless actions were to blame, she was still unable to acknowledge her own shortcomings. In addition, my parents were at their wits' end, and her spending patterns remained unchanged. Even a modest lifestyle could not be supported by the pensions my parents got, especially with my sister's extravagant spending adding to the load. My parents' meager money slowly started to run out because they were unable to stop spending on pricey clothes and pastimes, and because living expenses frequently fell short. My sister's carefree attitude of, "it'll be fine," persisted even after being encouraged to save, which put even more strain on my parents. Due to this circumstance, my parents had to go back to work in order to help pay for their living expenses. But there weren't many jobs for them in their later years. My father was compelled to perform physically taxing light labor, and my mother was obliged to take up new part-time work. Nevertheless, because of my sister's persistent spending, the income-to-expense ratio was never consistent, which made living more challenging. My sister didn't really care about the reasons, and my parents, who were losing their emotional and physical reserves, frequently quarreled as family relations deteriorated. My parents' retirement funds were soon exhausted by the cumulative effect of her spending, and they began to worry about money on a daily basis. At last, the aberrations that had existed in the home came to the surface, but there was no way to fix them. My sister and my parents' relationship only became more antagonistic. The stability created by buying the property fell apart, leaving only evidence of each person placing a lot of responsibility on the other. It was true that the things they had done to me had come back to haunt them. I didn't look back as I considered the time and effort I had put in for my family. Finally, I had decided to live my life for myself. I decorated the interior of my new home to my taste, making it a cozy place for me to work. In my spare time, I delighted in engaging with new acquaintances and engaging in my interests. I had finally found true freedom and tranquility after being set free from a family that only wanted to take advantage of me.